The Alliance of Small Island States, Aosis, is a coalition of small island and low-lying coastal countries that share similar development challenges and concerns about the environment, especially their vulnerability to the adverse effects of global climate change. It functions primarily as a negotiating voice for small island developing states within the United Nations system. Aosis has a membership of 44 states and observers drawn from all oceans and regions of the world. Their work dates back to 1987, where the president of the Maldives voiced his concern over the dangers that climate change would impose on atolls, followed by the president of Tuvalu in 1990, who helped raise international attention about the implications of climate change for vulnerable nations of the Pacific. Early on, Aosis earned a reputation for advocating for policies based on scientific facts and for a reduction in emissions to a level that is consistent with the survival of all members. In fact, in 1994, Nauru submitted the first UN proposal calling for a multilateral approach to tackling the dilemma, what would eventually become the Kyoto Protocol. Aosis has successfully highlighted their strong exposure to changing climatic conditions and the negative effects of climate change for all countries. They help to forge coalitions with more powerful groups of countries, and they organize themselves into a tight negotiation coalition. Their soft negotiation strategies help play an important role in the climate regime up to the 1997 Kyoto Protocol. They managed to highlight common interests, raise moral concerns, as well as play by the rules. Aosis countries used a discourse of vulnerability which was based on existing principles such as the polluter pays and the precautionary principle. The extreme sensitivity of small islands to the consequences of climate change gives Aosis moral leverage. The moral argument is that the countries who have done the least to create the problem are the ones who will be suffering most. Aosis countries are being hit first and hardest by climate change that they are not responsible for. In the words of Lionel Hurst, 1993, the contribution to climate change of such small island states is zero, while the impact of climate change will literally reduce them to zero. Cleverly, Aosis uses a target-based strand of argumentation that emphasizes the higher cost of inaction and invokes the self-interests of all the states. They present a safe climate as being in the best interest of all states. However, the UNFCCC Convention still lacks any binding hard law commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Underlying Aosis's argumentation is a strong reliance on scientific evidence, which was facilitated by NGOs. NGOs provide technical information, legal advice, and capacity to the group. NGO support translates into power in the climate change negotiations, for it gives the small island states and developing countries the chance to participate with much larger and better resource delegation. Despite these achievements, Aosis has been unable to facilitate outcomes for mitigating climate change. Nonetheless, given their size, they did or do have a significant influence over the UNFCCC process. The UNFCCC Convention's main objective is summarised in Article 2, to achieve the stabilisation of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change, to ensure that food production is not threatened, and enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. The ambiguity of dangerousness is seriously significant given that it is the ultimate objective of the Convention. This definition has problematic implications to small island states, where every rise in warming is too high, as it will affect sea level rise, coral bleaching, and socio-ecological systems. Article 4.8 of the UNFCCC commits developed countries to assisting countries that are particularly vulnerable, including small island nations. Unfortunately, these commitments are non-binding and there are no defined targets. There has been significant achievements by Aosis, such as obtaining a seat on the Bureau, a position that until then had been the privilege of only the 5 UN regional groups. They also obtained a seat in other UNFCCC bodies, such as the Executive Board of the Clean Development Mechanism and the boards of the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. Common interests and domestic circumstances have brought the states of Aosis together. Common challenges include their disproportionate vulnerability to the adverse effects of climate change. While contributing the least to global greenhouse gas emissions, the root cause of anthropogenic climate change, Aosis states may experience the most dire and immediate impacts, including the possibility of extinction. Island states worldwide recognize this commonality early, as well as the need for interregional cooperation, given their very limited individual economic and political voice. They are microstates, and ecologically, most of them are coastal entities with small and dispersed land areas, which individually and collectively comprise less than 1% of world territory, population, gross domestic product, and greenhouse gas emissions. Many of its members have a small population size, few human resources, and a dependence on aid. There are, however, differentiated interests or tensions within Aosis. Aosis countries differ in how climate change affects them and thus value certain issues very differently. Their individual interests may thus be relatively far from the coalition's position in some areas. Climate change threatens the very existence of some states that consist exclusively of low-lying atolls, such as the Maldives, Kiribati, or Tuvalu, while other countries such as Belize or Cuba face serious impacts in coastal zones but may actually be able to adapt. Differences in positions among the members of Aosis have become increasingly evident in relation to specific issue areas, particularly those related to land use change, and forestry. Tuvalu and Samoa believe that the primary priority of mitigation should rest with the reduction of emissions and that the enhancement of sinks is an additional activity in the short term. Climate regulations affect members differently also. Countries such as PNG, Suriname, and Guyana have large amounts of tropical forests and are interested in earning emissions reductions compensation payments as part of REDD by controlling deforestation, while other states believe that this does not significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Tuvalu has made it clear in several submissions that it is against both the inclusion of REDD activities in the carbon market and the granting of credits or early action. It has instead proposed a non-market REDD mechanism. While others, in particular Singapore with its large harbour, have a special interest in bunker fuels and maritime transport. There are also tensions between Aosis members who are members of the G77 or who are aligned with G77, which holds the views that emissions reductions should be restricted to Annex 1 parties only, while other non-G77 members like the Cook Islands or Tuvalu hold the view that the large developing countries should also reduce their emissions. While divergent interests can sometimes hinder members of a coalition from reaching common ground, the more issues that are simultaneously negotiated, the more opportunities there may be for issues linkages and side payments. Thus, if a country is reluctant to agree to a joint position on an issue, it might be able to gain support in return for promising to support a member on another issue that it values highly. This suggests that although Aosis still remains a fairly tight negotiating condition, it may have become more difficult to maintain unity among its members. Article 3 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change calls parties to protect the climate system on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Both the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol are explicitly based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which entitles or requires all concerned states to participate in international response measures aimed at addressing environmental problems. It leads to the adoption and implementation of different commitments for states, taking into account their diverse situations, circumstances and capacities, their historical contribution to the problem, and future development needs. It entitles less developed countries to assistance in the implementation of their commitments. Redistribution of resources is another way of differentiating between countries in international environmental agreements, which can be in the form of assistance given to less or especially vulnerable states to build capacity or by allocation of financial assistance and transfer of technology. The protocol makes a distinction between industrial and developing countries. The former have binding emissions reductions obligations, and the latter not. A further division is made between Annex 1 countries that have been given different commitments. Going forward, one glaring challenge of this principle will be to define the group of fast-growing developing countries that emit large amounts of greenhouse gases. The head of Aosis claims that climate negotiations have become very divorced from the decision makers in capitals around the world, who are actually the ones who must choose to solve this problem or not. She puts increased pressure. The former president of Nauru believes that the UNFCCC talks have become, quote, lost in a fog of rhetoric and jargon. As accounting experts establish budgets, international lawyers fuss over the precise wording of clauses, and states stall to ensure that their domestic and international obligations and pressures are met in what is referred to as the two-level game. However, this complexity cannot be used as a disguise to limit progress, and perhaps the UNFCCC should look at implementing some of the strategies of enhancing effectiveness and efficiency as suggested by Aosis.